Hello and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. My name is Dan Taylor.
My name is John Micton. Join us twice a month at the International Schools Podcast as we have conversations with international school leaders, educators, and entrepreneurs working and engaging in the world of international schools and education.
Now on to the episode. Hi and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm here as always with John Micton. John, how are you doing?
Good. I love these little impromptu topics. They're like our little special, we throw it out. And so, Dan, when you said this cybersecurity, I was like, oh, what a coincidence. I just did a thing with senior citizens and with parents at where I work. So, and you just did one at ECIS. So it's
I
really
just
kind
did
of cool that we get to chat.
Exactly, yeah. Cybersecurity for school leaders. And actually, this presentation is kind of a basic. We're going to go through that and we're going to discuss it and ask questions and stuff. So, yeah, I just did that. I've got a huge interest in cybersecurity and I'm getting much more interested in and much more active in it. You've got a great perspective, John, because you've worked in international schools in at least 3 continents. And I've no doubt suffered multiple cyber attacks and have multiple meetings about it. So, you've got a great perspective as well.
Absolutely. And then I think one thing that I've really tried to do, and I think that's something that you mentioned, maybe we can talk about. It's still really under the radar and it's hard to get traction and get school leaders and even faculty. And I think what in some schools with GDPR, they had to do a lot of audits, and one was a cyber audit. And that kind of percolated up issues of phishing and kind of holes in the systems. So then cybersecurity became a little more of a prominent topic in some of the schools that I was collaborating with in Europe. And but tell us a bit about your adventure, because you were the only IT topic at this conference.
I was the only IT topic. Yeah, I mean, it's unusual, I mean, obviously, EACOS, which is the kind of Asian equivalent. I know ECIS is global now, but it's the Asian equivalent it was a lot of tech sessions. If this wasn't, that's why Nancy, our mutual friend, asked me to speak at the last minute. She realized they didn't have many tech sessions, so that was kind of the thing behind it. And I said, great, I'd love to come. So yeah, it was really interesting. I would think. I mean, and I ran my idea past you, and you even said, yeah. I mean, a lot of school leaders don't have. They want just a tech director to think about this. They don't. It's not something they have experience of. They don't feel they have knowledge in it. You mentioned they have fragmented like reference points, and I think there's obviously a lot of time a problem with school leaders that they're not involved enough with cybersecurity.
So the goal of this workshop then, Dan, was really targeting, because that you went to the ECIS Leadership Conference in Dusseldorf.
Yeah.
And the idea was then to kind of highlight that specific to school leaders. And I think some CFOs were there.
Yeah, exactly right. So, all kinds of people, curriculum people. Yeah, exactly. Some like heads of, head of elementary school, I mean, all different kind of leadership. But what we talked about was like, I put a slide on here, like kind of the big picture. What is the big picture in terms of the risks to schools? We talked about the basics of cyber attacks. What is phishing? What is malware? How does ransomware fit into that, etc. Bit about the basics of cybersecurity, and then got into some Google security. We won't talk about the Google stuff today. We'll just cover the sort of general cybersecurity stuff. I mean,
but Dan, I know you don't want to talk about it, but I think people need to understand it. And I know Microsoft is the same. Both those platforms invest a lot in their security environment.
Yeah.
Education space, and there are a lot of powerful tools. So I just think our audience should, understand both those ecosystems have invested a lot in that space. And I know you don't want to focus on that, but I think it's important to highlight.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I'd love to. I want to keep our audience.
You don't want to make it a Google thing. I understand.
Yeah.
That's why I'm the word Microsoft.
Exactly. No, I mean, there's one thing. It's interesting. We had obviously, if Mark from 9, he was at the presentation as well, and we talked a lot. And very high level, if you have like a completely cloud-based system, whether it's based on Google, Microsoft, and a bunch of cloud systems, you don't have a physical server. It's actually quite hard to get like a ransomware attack. And if you do, you've got no issue. It's backed up. You'll be up and running again very quickly. It's most of these attacks come when you have a physical server infrastructure at your school. That's kind of an interesting thing just to say up front about using Google or using Microsoft. If you use the online version of Microsoft, not the server based.
I think you bring up an important point because in a lot of schools they have migrated to something like Google or Microsoft or some cloud based, but a lot of servers are still in the home. So, for example, some
Yeah,
student information systems prefer a server on campus for customization and management. So, I think schools need to be mindful that whatever servers they have on in a physical space somewhere in a building, those are the ones that might have to need a good looking at.
I think obviously the issue, not the issue, but the reality is, schools are very much at the mercy of of the tech director, because obviously, the leadership rely on what the tech director tells them. And if you recruit a tech director who is maybe worked their whole life in this client server area, maybe they're a Microsoft engineer, the cloud is, maybe they're reluctant to move to the cloud because it's new, and they might convince the school not to do it because um, they're a bit scared of it. Not that I mean, this is just my opinion. I mean, some people would say go client, have your own servers all the way, but you know what I mean. I think it's that's kind of the issue. Is I think that's why it's good to have a school cybersecurity strategy, and I think a good tech director will try to get leadership involved in that. So they're not just giving them their opinion, and everyone's just taking their opinion blindly.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. And I think that, as you're stating, that shared approach of a tech director making sure and the IT manager that their leadership is aware and has that understanding. The other thing is there's so many great organizations, and I know in a couple settings where I was, heading the IT department, leveraging some local cybersecurity companies can be really helpful. It's some good contacts, and they can also kind of act as like a guide or even a reference point as you're having those conversations. And I know, Dan, you do that with a lot of schools with the service that you provide. And I think
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
also a nice approach.
Yeah, we're expanding that. We've just partnered with Know Before. I'm sure you know Before. They do simulated phishing attacks and training. We've become a partner with them as well because they're a great solution, sort of low cost. But yeah, I mean, to come back to schools, I mean, basically, cybersecurity. I mean, schools were a big target. Is the issue? I mean, it's interesting. As part of the session, we actually took a look at the dark web together. I went to some of these ransomware groups, and we actually had a look at their pages. They're really funny, in a way that it's very. There's some good comedy in there, but it listed all the organizations that they had released the data, exfiltrated the data for, and about a bit more than a third were schools, either colleges, school districts, private schools. So, I mean, education is a big target. I mean, curious to know why you think it is. I think it's schools that may be perceived to have not as good security as enterprise. The first thing. Second thing, I think, is especially sort of state schools. If people think, well, they've got budget, like they have budget, they'll just pay, etc. And so, schools are a target. Not we'll talk about phishing and other things as well, but especially for ransomware. I'm not sure if you've got any opinion about why that's the case.
Well, I think also, and I think you brought up the point that often schools are maybe not as well versed in the dynamics and the nuances of cybersecurity. So it leaves them potentially perceived as a soft target. And
Yeah,
also, if you think of the parent community that many schools have, very wealthy, usually middle class, a
yeah,
lot of good contact emails, etc. A lot of them are captains of industry or women leaders in different organizations or in
yeah.
corporations. And I think that in itself is an interesting group of people to have that information of.
Yeah, and we'll talk a bit later. I mean, there's obviously we'll talk about ransomware. There's a lot of very over ingenious schemes people do. Fee fraud is a big one where you know a group will compromise. Say, let's say they'll compromise a Google account on the school because if the school use Google single sign-on to get into the billing system, and they'll get onto the billing system and they'll just send emails out to all the parents saying you have to pay an extra fee. This happened recently. That when I did the presentation, 4 people in the room had this happen to them. There was a well-known, I won't say which student information system it was, but there's a well-known system that has a billing module, and they emailed all the parents, and 20% of the parents paid the extra fee.
And that's amazing. And also, a few years ago, there is an international school that got its site cloned
Yep.
and the admissions portal. And so the potential parents were paying admissions fees to this clone site.
That's amazing. I mean, like the thing is, even it's obviously really bad, but it is you have to respect the ingenuity of these groups. It's crazy.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a lot of creativity, but at the same time, it shows how often maybe a certain complacency or
Yeah,
feeling, oh, we're a school, we're not a bank, we're not a financial institution, sometimes might give you the sense, oh, we don't need to worry. That shouldn't be a priority. And I think what I'm hearing from you and from my few points of reference, it's definitely something that should be a high
it
priority.
should be a high priority, definitely. So, just a few more things. I'm just going to fly through these slides because I don't want to get too much into the numbers, but malware is increasing, and we'll talk a bit about what malware is a bit later on. Although, interestingly, I've got a really good research I've discovered that the actual amount paid out is going down, partly because the US and the UK have effectively banned you paying ransomware parents, because they say it's financing money laundering and illegal activity, so you
Yeah,
actually can't pay. So it's interesting that the number is going down, but we'll come on to that.
that's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, phishing attacks. We'll talk about phishing. Let's jump into this. Yeah, but anyway, I mean, 93% increase on cyber attacks to education sector between 2020 and 2021. A lot more happened during COVID as well. So this has gone up even more, but it's an increasing threat. And it's increasing in international schools just because there's so many international schools now, and it's a market worth targeting. When it was just a few small schools, it wasn't something that was really on anyone's radar as a hacker, but now, it is.
I think your points are interesting. If you don't mind going back, is this
Yeah.
idea, what are the negatives or what happens? Is this loss of credibility, loss of reputation? It can impact schoolwork. I mean,
Yeah.
there just this kind of domino effect if that happens.
Yeah, well, let me jump onto the types of cyber attack, and then because we can talk about the specific points, like what actually are the risks. But I mean, I think a big picture for anyone listening to this, school leader, tech directors should know this already. But the idea is don't wait until a breach happens before you put the strategy in place. But there's a big but, and the big but is be ready to react if it does, because there's a good chance it will. So your plan has to include prevention and reacting to the situation, and have a team ready to do that, because you can't be thinking of a plan once you've been hacked. The plan should be ready to go. These are the types of attacks we could suffer. This is what we'll do in this situation. This is our strategy. And I think if you do that and you plan it in advance, just like the people who managed to plan a fully remote teaching were in an amazing position before COVID. If you plan ahead, then it will help you a huge amount, I think.
So true.
Um, so let's go into the basics of cyber attacks. Like, these are kind of like the top six, and we'll talk a bit about these individually. Social engineering is not really a type of cyber attack, but almost every cyber attack includes an element of social engineering. Phishing, you probably had received emails purporting to be from somewhere else. This is really common. We'll talk a bit about phishing. Malware is where you get infected software onto your computer, and ransomware is part of it. So we'll talk a bit about that. And we'll talk a bit about DDoS. Interestingly, DDoS is where you get a hacker will use a network of computers to flood your website or your server or your computer with traffic. Interestingly, when I looked at the numbers, this is usually done by students or parents. Interestingly, disaffected parents have done this quite often to schools. It's absolutely amazing. It's a
That's crazy.
non-technical thing to do. You can buy access to a botnet from on the dark web pretty easily and just do a DDoS attack on somebody. So
Just so people know, social engineering means when humans versus humans are interacting with each other, and a human might give information over voice. Oh, you have it right there.
yeah,
Sorry.
so it's the art of manipulating, influencing, or deceiving you in order to gain control over your computer system. And the hacker might use phone, email, snail mail, or direct contact. I mean, it could be, I could be social engineering you now, John, to tell us to get access to your system. I mean, it could be anything. What's really interesting, I think I've told you the story. I was at DEF CON, which is a hacker conference in Las Vegas a few years ago. It was absolutely amazing. I want to take my son there when he's a little bit older. But they had a social engineering room. And I thought I'll go there for an hour. I ended up spending a whole day there. I just stayed. I didn't go to anything else. I spent a whole day in this room. What this room was, it was a live. They were hacking live. So there was a stage, and they had a soundproof screen on the stage, so that so that the audience's sound didn't come. And they picked a company. So they picked Dell computers when I was there. And he had to call it Dell, and he had a list of things he had to get. He had to get the username, the password, and then there was like bonus things. There was your memorable information, your password number, da 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 da. And these guys were just guys and girls on the stage. were doing this, and it's interesting, because they had a soundproof screen, and one of the reasons was because when they put some sensitive information, they cut the sound because you've got a room full of hackers who will immediately be hacking, all these people. And what was
That's
amazing is some of these people, uh, two or three specifically, they got all the information easily, the username, password. They just kept going. They got their banking, they got their banking log on, their banking password. They got them to they got sent the code so they could set up the Google Authenticator app on their phone, so the hacker could do two-factor authentication for them. This was all just on a phone call. This was no hacking whatsoever. They got the person to give all this information. I think people
that's amazing.
it's unbelievable. I mean, everything. They had everything. They had full access to their entire life, personal and business lives.
I
Just from
witnessed
a phone
one
call.
where this journalist asked this hacker, a young lady, and she ran a YouTube soundtrack of a baby crying,
Yeah.
and then called a cell phone company and was making the baby cry, say she was newly married, and the person on the other side just couldn't handle the baby crying and pretty much gave everything.
Well, that's really common. I mean, there's a common thing now. There's a few cases recently where, I mean, this is really taking this to a horrendous level where they'll call up people's grandparents and say they've kidnapped their grandchild. And they'll have someone screaming in the background, and you have to pay the ransom. And this is quite common, And
That's crazy. And I think that's an interesting point, is that a group, unfortunately, that is often targeted and usually not to their own, not for any fault of their own, usually doesn't have as much awareness of digital skills as senior citizens.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
heard some
John,
great
obviously you're an expert in this topic.
I'm
You
not
work with
an
senior
expert,
citizens
but
on technology.
I work with senior citizens, yeah, and the figure was just astounding. I mean, a few dollars every year in the U.S. towards senior citizens. And working with senior citizens, I definitely can see how difficult it is, especially when you are not as adept or not coming from a background of
Yeah.
using a lot of digital tools.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's a guy, I'm going to look up his YouTube channel. There's a guy called Hacker, what's his name? I'll put it in the show notes, but he's really, really funny guy. He basically he targets people that are targeting, like these old people and stuff, and he'll keep them on for hours, messing them around, and often he'll hack their computers while so he'll pretend to be an old person, and
Oh,
and they'll
good for
contact him thinking he's the old person. He'll then hack them, and often he's amazing. Quite often he'll hack the video cameras in their office and stuff, and he'll be like saying, you're wearing a blue t-shirt, and then they'll be freaking out and things. So I'll send you a link. I'll put the link in the show
That's
notes.
not that I am for vigilante kind of dispositions, but that's kind of cool because I've entertained some very sad stories with the participants in the groups that I support here in my
Yeah.
hometown. So that's crazy.
But interestingly, social engineering, I mean, just so you understand, I mean, 98%, effectively every attack relies on some kind of social engineering. It might be email. I mean, phishing is essentially social engineering. It's how it all starts. So, and it's not, it can be like, if you've ever been at maybe some event and you've met someone who was a bit shady and asking you some strange questions, I mean, it can be face to face as well. People can target, it's unlikely to happen to people who work for schools because, if you work in say the British Embassy, I mean, I know someone who works for the British Embassy. I mean, you're trained because you will meet people in real life who are out to compromise you or find information out and things. So you're actually trained to protect that. Schools, it's pretty unlikely you're going to meet people face to face trying to get to the school through a meeting, but anything's possible there.
One area that is very popular and unfortunately some very sad stories is through dating apps, and they're actually criminal gangs out of Cambodia that facilitate dating app relationships, and
it's worse than that. So I'll send you an email to a great podcast I listen to. It's called I'll just pull it up right now. It's called.
We talked about that last time. You remember?
Yeah, Underworld, so in Cambodia they're using slave labor. They basically recruit people from across Asia who speak different languages. They might speak Philippine, they might speak Vietnamese, whatever, and they give them these targets they can't make, and they keep them. It's in these, they call them special economic zones in Cambodia, and they're doing these dating scams. So they run them from these huge centers, and these special economic zones, which are supposed to be to encourage economic growth, are just run by these Chinese warlords basically. And it's like this. You definitely should listen to this podcast because they actually go into and speak to these people. It's absolutely fascinating.
Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by cybercrime, but it is horrendous. But yeah, phishing. Let's jump on to phishing. 'Cause this is really, really common. This is how you've all received emails from saying they're from a bank. That's general blanket phishing. That's not as common. I mean, if you use Google, it's pretty good at picking up these emails.
Yeah,
Spear
absolutely.
phishing, which is normally just called phishing, is where you send a focused, targeted attack via email. So I'll give you an example. We're just, I was mentioning before, we just partner with KnowBe4, which is a phenomenal organization. A lot of international schools use them. They do simulated phishing attacks. And one thing they will do is they'll send an email out from saying they're from the Google administrator. Have an email, a domain looks something like Google, but it's different. It'll say, "Hey, we need your your username and password to get in." For some reason, they'll give it a reason. The system's been compromised. We're resetting passwords. It'll give a reason. And then with the KnowBe4, which we can help with, you get a dashboard and you can see real time who's clicking on this. Now, I was in South Korea recently and I was with a tech director. I won't say the school for obvious reasons. We're in the pub and it was how he was showing me on the phone, live. We were looking at this. And just while we were in the pub and it hadn't finished yet, 25% of all staff had clicked on the link and 15% had given their username and password.
Wow, that's amazing. It's interesting, Dan. When GDPR came about, I actually worked with Mark from Nine, and they came and did some phishing attacks, and really kind of poked holes everywhere. And it was very sobering to see how many potential holes you could have. And I think every school should be getting an organization like you mentioned, or even yourself, or with a local cybersecurity company, and be practicing these phishing emails and the spear phishing, especially because now with AI, I'm finding I've had a couple instances where the emails have been really good. And I mean, it's
Oh,
really,
yeah, they're good.
the
Exactly.
spelling mistakes and the funky links all gone. And it was just me thinking, no, I'm not doing anything with that organization, or I did, but not recently, and just spam it. But I think the spear phishing is becoming far more sophisticated. Thus, as you were saying, the importance of getting these practice runs with your faculties.
Yeah, definitely. Get in touch if you're interested. And one thing I would say about that is, know before it's quite low cost, so it's great. It doesn't cost you too much to do a simulated phishing attack. And if you're a tech director listening to this, or anyone, a school leadership person, and you want to get your people your staff interested in cybersecurity, like do this first, because then you come to these people and you say, listen, X staff member, you give your username and password, the system's compromised, and you can come to it and then you have a data point to say, look, 25% of you did this. That's a lot, and people realize they do need training at that point, I think, which, as
Yeah,
you've done
absolutely.
this yourself. So malware. Now, malware is really interesting. Like malware is where you get some malicious software onto a system. Now, we talked in the beginning about if you've got a completely cloud-based system, it's not as dangerous. But there's a lot of types of malware. You probably heard about worms, Trojans. These are kind of the point of entry. I'll just mention a really interesting one that's happening a lot at international schools now is cryptojacking. I'm not sure if you've come across this, John. It's quite a recent thing.
I read a couple things on LinkedIn about some people highlighting that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not done maliciously in the sense of it's not done to cause the school harm. It's just literally someone in the tech department is mining for crypto on the school service. 'Cause schools, if they've got some decent sized servers, they'll often do it at night or the weekends, and in their mind they're not doing any harm because they're doing it when the school's not doing. But it causes
Using a lot of
issues.
energy and
Uses
processing.
a lot of energy. Nobody can. I mean, it can cause servers crash, and this is very common. It's common across all businesses, but especially in schools. Because a lot of tech staff in schools think they can get away with it.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Now, ransomware is a huge point for schools. So ransomware. Some of you watching or listening to this may have unfortunately been a victim of ransomware. Ransomware is where you receive it's a type of malware. You receive this this ransomware. It locks you out of your system, and they ask for a ransom, always in crypto. So they ask for the ransom, and there's two real risks about ransomware. One is loss of access to your system, and the second is the data is released to the public. Now, the first one, it's interesting. We talked earlier about if you've got a fully cloud-based system, the risk to your system isn't very high. You can you've got backups. You can restore it. You can restore Google after a ransomware. It's very unlikely Google will get a ransomware attack, but if it did, and I'll talk about how that happens. You can bring it up. The big risk is your data being exfiltrated. I mean, that's a huge problem for school. You're dealing with children. You're dealing with vulnerable reports. You're dealing with staff assessments. You're dealing with a lot of
Parent
sensitive information.
addresses, parent information. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
So
It's interesting, Dan. I was teaching my principal training course a couple summers ago, and one of the school directors in a part of the world had just come out of a ransomware, and I was just unbelievable how to shut down the whole school. Something that, and I've done some research in this, is a lot of government organizations I know, like in Luxembourg and in France, and I think in Belgium too. There are nonprofit organizations that support nonprofits when there's a ransomware, and you can contact them, and they will give you cyber engineers and white hackers to come and support you. So be mindful of what resources are in your area, because I think more and more governments, as you said, Dan, are mindful how critical that is. And if you're a school, if I'm just imagining, if I was a tech director in one of the previous positions, I don't think, however much I thought I might know about it, managing ransomware really needs a lot of expertise, and you have to be very cautious.
it does, and the reality is, they are gonna dump your data if you don't pay. That's the reality. Now, it's interesting. I was looking at the numbers. I mean, these even. I mean, and remember, if you pay, it's 35% of the ransomware groups then try to re-extort you later. So even if you pay, that's not the end of it. So paying is not the solution. It's easy for me to say, like, don't pay.
Yeah, of course.
But and if you do pay, normally your cyber insurance is going to be dealing with this. Now, because international schools are normally not in the US and the UK, and they're in a grey area legally, some do pay. There's no doubt about it. I think very few will ever admit it, but quite a few do pay.
I just think, again, if you are a school leader and IT team and thinking you don't have anything, look at the local resources. There's some very reputable and excellent organizations supporting nonprofits in this area. So,
Yeah.
for example, in Luxembourg, we had a thing called the Circle, and it was a whole bunch of volunteers that were in the industry and for-profit companies, but volunteered their time for NGOs, and they were fantastic.
That's great. I mean, and the thing is, it's interesting. It's part of my talk. We took a look at the dark web. Now, the dark web is really interesting. It's because I'm fascinated with cybercrime, as you know, John. This is like a huge. I listen to podcasts about it. I just I know a lot about it, and the dark web's interesting.
That's
So
why I
this is
don't
what
bring devices to your house, Dan.
I'm not a hacker, John. I'm just an
I know.
enthusiast. I'm just
I'm
interested.
kidding.
No, but what's interesting is, by the way, I couldn't even get the Xbox working today, so I'm supposedly this technical guy. And my wife, embarrassing my wife, who's not technical at all, came and got it working. But like the dark web. So the dark web, it's interesting. In case you're wondering what it is, it was actually developed by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in the 90s, and it's nothing illegal. It's actually the Tor network, TOR, which means the onion router, which essentially an onion, like an onion, has multiple layers of skin. It's multiple layers of security. It's an encrypted network. I mean, you can find sites like Facebook have an onion website, and if you see a domain that ends .onion, that means it can only be accessed by the Tor network, which is called the dark web. And you have these dark web marketplaces. Most people have probably heard of the Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht, which was closed down. Now there's lots of these networks and all kinds of trades in illegal activities going. And one of the things is obviously ransomware. And you have something called RAAS. You have software as a service. You also have ransomware as a service. So different models, you can actually buy access to their software. Sometimes you pay them a commission. We looked at some websites together, and see, these people have their own websites, on the dark web. Quite often they'll take 20%. The ransomware software company will take 20% of the ransom. And so, I mean, just to let you know that a lot of the time you're not dealing with sophisticated hackers. You're dealing with just someone who's a bit dodgy, who's got on the dark web, who's licensing, paid some Bitcoin, has got access to this access to this system and is hacking people. They're not. I mean, you tend to think that they're all tech geniuses, but a lot of them are pretty amateurish, and they still get
Well, I
away with
think
it.
that's the thing, and you'd mentioned students before. The thing is, you can go onto the dark web or even on YouTube, and there are a lot of tutorials on how to do this. I mean,
Yep.
pretty much if you have an internet connection and are willing to listen to a video and are used to, learning from visual and audio, you can quickly walk away with some tools and strategies to cause some harm and damage.
And it's interesting. I mean, so at the session at ECAS, a couple of the people there said that they'd been hacked by their students, and the students usually weren't trying to steal money with, and they were just trying to impress their friends or show they could do it.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, the schools were like, they had to punish the students, but on the other hand, it was like, well, we've taught them some good tech skills. Like it's
But the thing too is you have to be mindful because if students do that, there can be legal repercussions in certain
there can
countries.
be.
And you really, I think, uh, that's something to be really mindful of. You are
Yeah,
playing with fire.
definitely. And well, I mean, you shouldn't be in a situation where students can do that. That should
No,
be,
absolutely not.
ever happen. Um,
And that's interesting, Dan, because often tech directors are reticent to have junior tech teams go into the server room. And, when kids want to learn about IT in the IT department, often it's the creative tension. How much do we give them access? And, after a while, just plugging in cables and monitors doesn't, is not very interesting. So
it's it's
that often
it's
is an issue.
it's amazing how many they call it shoulder. It's a type of hacking, shoulder surfing, which just means looking over. It's amazing how many schools get hacked because someone's put a post-it note next to the monitor with the username and password.
Yeah. Yeah.
That happens all the time. That's like I don't know where that ranks, but it's one of the most common ways someone will get access to your system.
And it's interesting through the GDPR process for many schools, that whole thing with passwords on the screen, not locking your screen, all those things percolated up. And I think having collaborated and also been part of groups, a lot of schools really kind of upped their ante in this whole area, really understanding something as basic as leaving a computer screen with a student information system open and you go away for a couple hours. Well, anybody could come in and get a lot of information.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I put my computer on sleep if I walk to the bathroom. I don't even leave it as I am in the next room. Um, but yeah, it's yeah, definitely very very interesting that. Um, so yeah, this was actually
So,
it's
Dan, as
improving.
you're doing this presentation, what kind of reactions are you getting? So, the audience that came to you obviously were not experts. They were curious or they had a baseline of understanding. What were kind of the reactions as you're going through these slides, which, are quite high stakes? Some of this stuff we're talking, potential major issue for a
Yeah,
school.
I think they're surprised, especially when we took a look at the dark web together, and they were just how in the open it is. Here's you could just buy
Yeah.
buy access to a ransomware attack there on how easy it was, how open it was. I think that was a surprise to people.
But
Um,
people have this idea that dark web, you have to kind of crawl into a tunnel and there's a special computer.
no,
Any computer, I mean, it's
it's a
right there.
modified
You just go
Firefox
to your
browser. Just Google for
yeah,
Tor browser. You can download it in 20 seconds, and you'll be up there.
and
There's
the
nothing to
world is
do.
there. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I think people were surprised. I think you tell the stories, but I mean, they all had stories. They knew they'd had stories of things happening in their school, so they know it happens. I think you know, in a sense, people don't want to think about it. It's just sort of like, oh, because
So what, Dan, I want to stop you on that because
yeah,
that's really important what you're saying. They don't want to think about it. What is the reticence of generally educators and just people and companies even that just don't want to deal with the cybersecurity? Is it because they think it's not their issue, it's not a problem, or is there just too many other things that are kind of blurring the noise of cybersecurity?
I think there's different reasons. I think part of it is like, why do a lot of people not go and get a regular health check? Maybe they're scared of what they're gonna find out. That's actually a real thing. I think that's one reason. I think they've just got another too many things to think about. They'd rather just let the tech director think about it. They don't, leadership doesn't want to have to worry about it. They don't really understand it. It's not something they really know, and they don't. they think they'll have to invest a lot of time to get up to speed on this. I think, I don't know. In my opinion, that's a couple of reasons.
No, I mean, it resonates. I've done many workshops, and I would say the people that are most engaged and really is the senior citizen audiences
Yeah,
that I work with. They
interesting.
definitely, it's a big issue
How
for
do
them.
they react to it? Are they surprised how easy it is? Or
They're aware, but they're really concerned at their capacity to be nimble enough, especially, remembering different passwords, having different layers of passwords. When you're working with people that are between the ages of 70 and 90, there are different capacities to remembering and managing. And for quite a few of the participants, they don't come from a digital world. A smartphone is something that their child gave them. So they
yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely. So we've just discussed the Tor network. So DDoS. This is one of the last ones we'll look at. I mean, this is pretty simple. It can be linked to a ransomware attack. So essentially, a DDoS attack might take your school website down. It might take your school server down. Um, it might take an individual computer down. Someone could then give it. Often people ask for a ransom to get it back up again, but often, we mentioned at the beginning, often students do this. It's quite easy. You can buy access to a ransom, a botnet on the dark web, for not very much money, and just cause some trouble. Parents have done this, which astounds me that an international
That's
school parent
amazing.
would do this, but it happens.
That's just incredible. I find that just amazing.
It's just like,
That yeah, that's
just when
really
you
vindictive. Yeah.
think you know everything about the world. But yeah, so that's DDoS. And this is one thing I want to talk about. The yeah, sorry, malicious insider shoulder surfing. These are just something. This is basic. It comes under the social engineering umbrella. So you have someone in your IT department. Maybe someone offers them some money to get access. Maybe they're annoyed about a bad performance review. Maybe they got something against the school. But a lot of attacks in companies and in schools happen from someone in the IT department who's disgruntled or gets paid by somebody else.
And also, I think so often people forget when, it's the unfortunate situation you have to let go a staff member. You should actually be shutting down all the accounts as you announce it, somebody in the
Yeah,
background. I've heard of schools that forgot, and it's 2-3 weeks later, and suddenly they send a big spam email to everybody. This is, security card, access to accounts,
yeah.
really understand. That's why mapping your systems is so important. Who has access to what levels becomes really important, especially if you get into some type of situation where people have to move on.
Yeah, exactly. Shoulder surfing. I mean, we mentioned before, if you have a student tech team, they go into the server room, someone's put a post-it note, or someone's typing in, they got a password written down, like a lot of, it's, we think about the genius, mysterious hacker in his black hoodie, but often it's really basic things, how people get hacked.
Yeah, yeah.
So man in the middle, this is really interesting. This is kind of at the last of the attacks. So this was maybe 10 years ago, I was in Prague. I met a friend of mine. I won't say which country he's from, but let's just say it was an Eastern European country. Good friend, very, very technical guy. And we were in there, and we were in Starbucks, and he said, "Oh, do you want to see what that person's looking at their computer?" And I was like, I was thinking, thought he was bluffing. So he pulled up his Firefox browser, and there's just a Firefox extension, nothing technical, called Firesheep. And he just he clicked on their name and pulled up their Facebook account on the screen. Like he could see what they were seeing on their screen. He had full control over it. Now, this is a man in the middle attack where, if you've got an unsecured Wi-Fi network, you can essentially use something called a packet sniffer. Now, Firesheep doesn't exist anymore. There's tools like Wireshark and things, and you can easily intercept the traffic. Now, this was before the days of, SSL. So now if you see a website, it normally says HTTPS instead of just HTTP, and the S is secure. Like Facebook in those days, wasn't SSL, wasn't HTTPS. Now it is. So it's not as easy to do that. But what people can do is, you're at Starbucks, someone gets access. They use Wireshark. They got in. They see all the traffic, and they'll often see usernames and password which are from unsecured. You might be entering a password to an unsecured website. Maybe it's your golf website, something like that. Now, 75% of people use the same password for everything. So if you know their password for their golf website, you know the password for their Microsoft account. So, this is why I mean I think a lot all schools should recommend for leadership, at least if not all staff, if you're ever on a school laptop and you're traveling in an airport at a cafe, open Wi-Fi, just use a VPN.
Yeah. And I can tell you, I have had the experience of colleagues going to the airport or traveling to a conference and coming back with an infected machine. I
Yeah,
don't think people understand when you go to the hotel or you go to Starbucks or to even to the grocery store or the airport, every time you're connecting to that Wi-Fi, please don't do banking. Don't do anything
yeah,
where you're sharing a username and password. Maybe go and find out the weather or how to travel from point A to B, or use a virtual private network. I'm just always astounded. You're at the airport and you see people banking on their phones, and they're not using some type of extra layer of security. So I think that man in the middle that you bring up is so important, and that's something that I have quite a few videos I've done in different school contexts, is kind of getting ready for the holidays and being mindful of that. Two-step
yeah,
verification, using
yeah.
the facial and the fingerprint, and then having a VPN. Add those layers, because at the end of the day, when you are in these open networks, you're just basically free fodder.
Yeah, and the other thing people do is, and this is really common. There's do you watch the series Mr. Robot, John?
Yes, yes,
I'm a
of
huge fan
course.
of Mr. Robot. They actually
Love
show this hack live where you do the cantenna with a Pringles can, the metal. You put a wire inside, use the inside metal. It's quite a good thing, and you could transmit. Well, it's very easy if you've got any technical knowledge to create your own Wi-Fi hotspot, your own Wi-Fi network. So sometimes you've been in a cafe and let's say you're in John's Cafe, and you might have seen like John's Cafe 2 and some other ones. Often, this is a hacker will just create a similar sounding network hotspot. They will give it a similar name to the cafe or the restaurant or the hotel, whatever. People just connect to it because it's the easiest connection. And then again, same thing. They've got even more access to you. They can use a packet sniffer. They can, so it's interesting. So like often when you connect to an open Wi-Fi network, it often isn't the network you think about it. I mean, this is very, very common.
Yeah, and that's what's astounding. And I think, Dan, which is great that you shared this with a group of school leaders, is the fact we today navigate on these digital devices pretty much day and night.
Yeah.
We do our hotel booking, we pay our phone bills, we do our banking. It is pretty much everything we do is online. And so to really navigate that without this basics of cybersecurity, I
Yeah.
think is really, shortchanging yourself. And I think schools, and I'm going to be a bit on my heart, should do much more vigorous efforts to be
Much more.
training and making people aware, especially their students too, and their faculty, because faculty travel all over on the holidays. So I think
Yeah.
it's still a topic that's not amplified enough.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, John, you're very, you present this on the principals training centers. Obviously, the schools you've worked at, you've really pushed this. But if you were going to guess, like, what percentage of schools do you think don't give their staff any awareness or any kind of training about this? Do you think there are some schools that don't do anything?
I think it's different levels of awareness. I think
Different
everybody
levels, yeah,
now
yeah,
knows about phishing, but how many go and get a company? So we've had companies in different contexts where I've been an IT director or head of IT, is that we've had a choreographed, curated phishing attacks, and really looking at that. So I think you have to be deliberate. You have to invest some money, and you have to find time amongst everything else that everybody wants to do. So I think it's different layers of
yeah.
engagement
Because
by
there's only
schools.
so many hours of PD, so many inset days, so many training sessions you can do, and you've also got to train on a million other important things. So it's really hard, isn't it?
Exactly, exactly. So it
Yeah.
makes it really hard.
So I want to. I'm gonna. We're down to the last 10 minutes, John. So I want to just finish like some basics here. And well, just this slide kind of summarizes how I see them, and this is just my opinion. People have different. You can slice and dice this in a million different ways, but I've divided them into like tech, what I call like tech things, and like human things. I mean, on the human thing, it's have a cybersecurity strategy plan, including a readiness plan for an incident. And afterwards, I'll show you the next slide. There's something called the NIST framework, which gives you 5 competencies. But have a plan, even if it's not a great plan. And Mike Tyson said everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. It's going to change, but a
Yeah,
plan's better than no plan.
Dan, on that plan, so many international schools have what they call a risk register.
Yeah,
So they have to analyze and audit the levels of risks that they have. And cybersecurity should prominently be in your risk register as one of the things that you should be mitigating. Boards
yeah,
often require risk register so that cybersecurity strategy plan, it's also about sustainability at the end of the day. So I
yeah.
think just be mindful in your risk register. You should have a focus on the cybersecurity strategy.
Definitely, and I'll come back to this slide, but I want to just recruit. Like, this is the NIST framework. This is one of many frameworks. It's the National Institute of Standards in the US, and this gives 5 capabilities of how you think about structuring your plan. One is identify what needs protection, what assets, what processes. Protect. How do you putting in the safeguards to ensure there's protection, and then detect. Like, there's been a hack. How do we detect it? There's been an incident. How do you respond to the incident, and then how do you recover from it? Now, what's
Those
interesting
are
about
great.
these is 3 of them presume you've been hacked. So this is why I was saying, like, plan for the best. But the reality is, even if you look at this cybersecurity framework, 3 out of 5 presume there's been an incident. You know what I mean? So, like,
Yeah.
you have to plan for it's going to happen, and how do we deal with it?
Yeah. I think often one of the things that I know schools hesitate, and even colleagues that are in the role of IT directors, is how do you identify your vulnerabilities? And I think that's where you get somebody from the outside. I
Exactly
think,
right.
having a budget every year of a significant portion dedicated to cybersecurity in the
Yeah.
long run is going to allow you to be in the first 2 top of the NIST framework and not in the 3 last ones.
Yeah, exactly. Just going to jump back in the slides really quickly. Yeah, exactly right. So, yeah. So first of all, yeah, and obviously, secondly, build your cybersecurity team. So obviously, you've got your tech director, you've got your leadership. You know, are you building a team with any other senior leaders? So you have, like, if an incident happens. So first of all, we will meet once a term, once a semester, and and review the security. And if an incident happens, these are the individual responsibilities. This person will deal with a GDPR, because obviously with GDPR, you have 72 hours to notify your authority. And in a lot of cases, you have to actually inform the people whose data has been breached, which could mean informing parents as well. So have a team ready. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, John, about your cybersecurity team at your school.
Absolutely. I think the leadership team need to be in there, even your maintenance and security people. But then again, have an outside resource, somebody that's an expert, because some of this cybersecurity stuff is quite complex. So having a resource that then you have a point person that can help translate it into what I would call more regular speak is so important. And making sure if you have a team like that, you're going to need to do audits. So you have to budget that. You need to have a
Yeah,
budget line for
got that
cybersecurity.
below the
And
line
nowadays,
budgets.
yeah,
Yeah, and again, yeah, exactly right. And education. We've already talked about education.
yeah,
You know, your IT staff needs to be educated. You need to educate your staff. Now, in terms of the tech stuff, you mentioned audits. Doing the security audit, if using Google, we do Google audits. It's a thing everyone should do. Everyone should do technology audits. Any thoughts on that, on John, on the technology audits?
yes, I'm a huge fan of technology audits and doing it on a regular basis. What you can do is some companies will do a 3-year contract, and that means that they'll maybe do your Wi-Fi and your hard network. Then they'll look
Yeah,
at student information systems, and then they'll look also third-party devices or even your learning management system. So definitely explore and do that on a regular basis. And it's a cycle. It's a bit like
yeah.
you were saying the blood test. It's good to go and get a blood test once a year.
Exactly. And then other basics. I mean, we've already talked about backups, do regular backups, and a good firewall. Now, I've actually missed one out of this list, and that one is, I'm sure you know, is two-factor authentication. Um,
Yes.
Now, two-factor authentication, this is where you can either get a text message, an SMS text message, as an extra layer of security, or you can use an app like Google's Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. Now, or you can even use a physical hardware device like a YubiKey. Now,
Yeah.
of those, the safest is and the best is the YubiKey, but that's obviously more of a hassle. So people have to have a physical key. Second best is use a Google
Okay.
Authenticator app or a different app. Third best is getting a text message because text messages can be spoofed, it can be made to look like, and it can be redirected. So, any thoughts on those tech factors, John?
So, two-step verification, I am a huge fan of. I know for some schools it's quite complex setting that up. And so, one thing is maybe think of layers of two-step verification. So, for example, everybody in your business office, everybody in your admissions should have, and any leadership team member, when they're walking on their phone, they should have two-step verification. Maybe
Yep.
you won't have all the faculty, but I definitely, you want to move to a place where everybody is using two-step verification. And if you're in the Google Education Workspace or the Microsoft Education Workspace, those now are far more nimble and much more easy to set up on a large scale through an Active Directory. So I think those are things definitely to consider, the two-step verification. I
Yeah,
just, I don't know how people, even if you're just getting a text message, it's better than nothing.
and yeah, exactly. Great point. I mean, and like that's a really good point you made because it's all about doing something rather than doing nothing. Like you can't be
Exactly.
100%. Like if you were up against a dedicated state actor, everyone in the world could be hacked. Everyone. There's
Yes.
nothing you could ever do. Even you, John, who's got good cybersecurity knowledge, myself, who's got fairly good knowledge. There's nothing we could do.
Yeah.
Fortunately, a highly motivated state actor probably isn't bothered about us. But anyone can be
We
hacked.
hope.
Like we hope. No, but I mean,
We'll have
everyone
a
can be
nasty
hacked.
surprise tomorrow morning.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, it's everyone can be hacked, and it's just a case of how much does somebody want to hack you? If someone's motivated enough and they have the right resources, that you can be hacked. So, like you say, something is better than nothing. That's
Yeah.
that's the key point. I want to quickly fly through just to one more slide at the end, just to mention Google quickly. So
Nice
Google setup.
presentation, Dan.
Thanks very much. Yeah, based on a Google presentation. So Google, I mean, we're obviously a Google partner. I mean, the vast majority, I think something like 80% of international schools use Google. And which is great as far as I'm concerned. Google has really good security. Even if you use the free version, the security is good. There's a huge number of phishing attacks, malware attacks every day on Google, and it blocks the vast majority of them. Now, and Google itself has a lot of security on their data centers, etc. I won't stop too much on these slides. What I do want to
I
say
think
is,
also, Dan, and I think it's an important point that you're bringing up. Google and Microsoft mirrors many of the things that Dan is sharing, because I
yeah,
know even though Google might dominate, there are a lot of schools working with Microsoft. One thing to avoid is not have an internal email server. You really
yes,
want to move your email to the cloud, because
great point.
there's a lot of cynics out there is like, oh, Google this and Microsoft that and Apple this, but they have the best paid cybersecurity experts on their payroll. There's
Yep,
no way your internal IT team, and no disrespect to all the fantastic men and women that are in IT departments around in schools, but there's just no way you have enough knowledge or capacity to keep up with everything. And so if you have an internal email server, my advice is get to the cloud ASAP.
yeah. I mean, I've heard different numbers of the average time to do a patch for a server update, anywhere between 3 days and a month. But it's not immediate in most cases.
Yeah.
And on your physical server, and Google is updating. So yeah, great point. I mean, if your Google is going to get hacked, most of ransomware in Google comes from one way. There's a Drive desktop sync, which I would say just turn off is my advice. That's where you can sync all your local files up to your Google Drive. Some people have it if they want to save local files, and this is how malware, in my experience, typically gets there. Also, some Chrome extensions, some workspace apps. So I mean, when you're doing your audit, that's one of the things we do in our audit. We review all these apps and extensions. We check about desktop sync. And if you set up
Extensions are important, Dan, because I think a lot of people don't realize Chrome extensions are not Google extensions. They're third-party companies.
exactly right.
And Google is, I would say that Apple's a little more rigorous about allowing
Correct.
apps onto their Play Store,
Yep.
especially for security and viruses, while Google has a more open philosophy. So sometimes these third-party apps, these Chrome extensions, can actually be liabilities or even cause some issues.
Yeah, exactly. So it's good to audit them. Um, I mentioned before Google security audit. I'm going to just mention as well Workspace Education Plus. There is a paid version, and not everyone can afford it. So I'm not. I mean, and like I said, the free version has great security, but there are some amazing things you get with Workspace Education Plus, and I want to just mention a couple here. Um, so one of the things you get is context-aware access. So that it will say basically based on these factors, it looks suspicious. Maybe this device is in this country, whatever. So it gives you a lot of specific, very specific ways to check things. The really interesting thing is security sandbox. Now, this is something that's only in Education Plus, and what you can do is when anybody receives an email attachment, it executes that file in a secure sandbox automatically. So then, you know if it's ransomware, and then you can block, and then you can immediately delete that email that went to all the people who received it centrally. So that sandbox is a big thing. Being able to, um, run something in a secure environment, run every attachment in a secure environment, and then see if it's malware.
So Dan, to piggyback on the sandbox idea, a lot of firewalls will do that. So I know I
Yeah.
worked with Fortinet and we had a sandbox and every attachment and file went into the sandbox.
Yeah,
So
and again,
if
have
you're
a
not
have a good firewall. Yeah. Sorry, John.
yeah. No, I just wanted to say that that's the same idea as what Google's doing, but if you don't have Google, but you have a really robust firewall and get some good training, many of those will have that
Exactly
feature.
right. Yes, Sonos, Fortinet, all the big brands are pretty good at
Yeah,
this sort of stuff. And you also get an alert center, you get security dashboard. Um, so a lot of things. I won't go into all these things now, but just if you're interested in it, get in touch. It is definitely worth it. Um, I mean, a lot of international schools are upgrading, but like I said, the free version is very good. The free version is very secure. Um, so whatever you use, you're pretty secure. And honestly, Microsoft's very secure as well. I'm not a Microsoft expert. You've had more experience than I have using it, but Microsoft puts a huge amount of effort into securing its data
absolutely.
too.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely. I've been very impressed with Microsoft on the back end. I know the IT teams that I manage that were working the Microsoft ecosystem always got some fantastic training. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to basic education,
Yeah,
awareness. And apart from awareness, actually letting people experience what a phishing email's like and being mindful. And I know one thing that happened in one context that I was running the IT department is we did some phishing, practices, and then we actually created an email called phishing at. And people would send an email. I'm not sure if this is a phishing email. Could you tell me? And that was like, perfect. We're at the right place.
it's in the
We're
name.
right there. You sent it, forwarded it to phishing, and you're asking. Well done. I mean, that's where you want to
Yeah,
get is
yeah,
that basic knowledge enough that they're not sure, they move it to somebody that does. And I think you can set that up as a school is to have that awareness. And it's a bit like first aid. We all have to do first aid.
yeah.
Every teacher in every international school every 2 years has to do first aid. Well, why not do a little cybersecurity every year?
Exactly. John, great note to finish on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a fun chat. Thank you very much. As always, you've got
Yes.
a great perspective. You've got a great perspective because you've worked for a lot of schools and you've seen the progression. Like you've been in the game for a couple of decades at least, and
Yes.
you've seen and you've seen it come from yes, no internet to this current situation.
Absolutely. And I think the next level of issues is all AI. What does it mean when you have sophisticated AI taking over the phishing attacks, the spear phishing attacks, where this can be automated? And that's a whole other topic
Yeah,
that
it's
I'm
already
actually
happening. I've
planning
been
to do.
reading about it. It's already happening, and it can really, I mean, hopefully the AI, the cybersecurity AI can match the hackers AI. That's what I would hope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great topic, Dan. Always
Cheers,
good to
John.
catch up. Thank
Thank
you
you.
to everybody for your support. And yeah, drop us some notes if this was helpful and any ideas that you want us to unpack again.
Yeah, John, I just want to say in closing, when I did this session last week, we had three podcast listeners in the room, which is great. So we
That's
have
great.
people
Yeah,
listening.
no, it's been wonderful. And I actually had a friend. They went to a conference far away, and they said, and they were coming to visit me afterwards. And the person said, "Oh, I listened to their podcast." So great.
That's
Yeah.
great.
No, and we really appreciate the
Yeah, we
support
do
and the
definitely.
messages and the retweets. Thank you. And we feel so fortunate to be able to do this, but also, Dan, I think we really enjoy the guests, and they're also gracious and generous.
Definitely. Yeah. And like, please give us a review on whatever you use, Apple Podcasts. Please send us an email. John and me love to get emails of people saying they've listened to the podcast. It's great, because a lot of the time you kind of like, we're talking here and we don't know who's listening. We don't get any feedback. So if you do listen,
Yeah.
even with negative feedback, we'll take it all, on the chin, so let us know.
Yeah. And this will be our special podcast. So we'll be releasing it at the end of the week, right, Dan?
Sounds good. Cheers, John.
Yeah. Okay. Ciao.